Hello, welcome to the Nutmeg from the Evening Standard. I'm Dan Kilpatrick. I'm joined this week by Jack Rosser, Malik Ouzia and Simon Collings to talk about the big talking points from London football over the weekend and look ahead to Monday night's games as well. Let's start with Fulham. We haven't given Fulham a lot of coverage on the show so far, but a massive win for them at Liverpool yesterday to make it 6 defeats on the bounce for Liverpool at Anfield. That's almost unprecedented for them, but also massively boost Fulham's survival hopes, put them level on points, I think, with Brighton, just one behind Newcastle and really looking like the form team down there. Simon, just before we started recording, you were talking about watching Fulham against Arsenal on the opening day when they were pretty dreadful. I remember watching that game as well, and they didn't look like a side who were going to have a good time of it in the Premier League. How transformed are they since then?
I mean, they're almost unrecognisable from the team that day. I remember watching them, and I think quite a few people, perhaps a bit harshly and perhaps a bit too eager, said this looks like a team that's going straight back down to the Championship. Partly because it was the same personnel. I think something we've seen now is obviously the likes of Anderson and Ina and players who come in have had time to settle. But you watch them on that first day, and the problems we saw when Fulham were last in the Premier League were there again. They were weak at the back. They didn't really offer anything going forward. And I watched them yesterday against Liverpool at Anfield, and they were a completely different team. And the biggest thing for me is I watched them, and they're so defensively solid and organised. And as much as they were playing against a Liverpool team pushing for a goal, I know Areola made some great saves, you didn't really get the feeling that Fulham were going to concede. They just looked so comfortable and so assured and so determined in what they were doing. And so settled. So I think Parker deserves a lot of credit for that, but also perhaps we need to look at the players who come in and improve that side, because it is a different team from the one that came up from the Championship. And I think they've got their recruitment pretty spot on this summer.
Yeah, I mean, just looking through the prism of Spurs, which is obviously my MO in life, but Fulham restricted Spurs, that front three, that kind of dream front three with Dele Alli, to very few chances. And it was obviously an own goal on Thursday that won it for Spurs. And then you look at what they did either side of that to Burnley and Palace, who are two sides that are above Fulham in the table. And it does give you a good idea of how defensively solid they are back there. Jack, Joachim Anderson has been probably the standout defender, it's fair to say. Have you been impressed by him?
Yeah, he's been fantastic, hasn't he? Sort of come in and like Simon said, obviously it's a completely new back four, a new goalkeeper as well. So none of them have any sort of familiarity, and he's come in and he's really commanding. He was struggling in France and brought here on loan, and he's already captain. He's getting so much love from the Fulham support. I think they're calling him and Tottenham the Thames barrier again. So Fulham have another Thames barrier once more. They've been fantastic, but that mentality at the back and how controlled they are sort of comes from Parker. I saw Andre Frank Zambo-Anguissa did an interview in The Observer over the weekend saying, if Scott Parker tells you something, you believe it. And you contrast that with what's going on around them. Newcastle, Bruce is presiding over some really turgid football and leaks and reports of bust-ups. They're banning reporters from press conferences. There are so many fires here, there and everywhere. Whereas at Fulham, everyone seems to be going in the same direction, and that sort of has to be credited to Parker.
I think the kind of other thing to add is that because of what we know about Parker as a player, we all made the assumption, I think, at the start of the season that it wasn't going to be for a lack of effort that they were going to go down. They were probably going to dig in and try hard for the manager. They did just look so short on quality. And the players he's brought in have, as you say, have changed that, whether that's defensively, and they've now got the quality at the back where they can sit in like they did in the second half yesterday and look pretty solid, or going the other way and players like Lookman and Madja who caused problems, and obviously Lamina, scoring a brilliant goal. So Parker deserves credit for that. I think he's done exactly what we expected in terms of kind of getting the kind of passion and unity that we're not seeing at Newcastle, but they have just sprinkled in that bit of quality, and it's making the difference.
Yeah, and I think you have to give the owner some credit as well. I think Shad Khan's kind of held his nerve quite well in some respects this season. I mean, the last time they went up, it was widely credited to just bringing in too many players and just having a mismatch of a squad that didn't kind of bed in and work as a team. But they were still brave in the transfer market over the summer. They brought in a lot of players to boost the Championship squad, and as you guys have said, those guys are now bedding in and looking like Premier League quality players, albeit it took a while. So in that respect, they held their nerve, and he's also stuck by Scott Parker. There was a period where it looked quite tense down there. I remember Parker kind of even coming out and contradicting Tony Khan at one point over transfers, I think. So it seemed like there was tension, but Fulham have stuck with their man, and they're reaping the rewards now. And I think, as Jack says, I think obviously a lot of people have a soft spot for Brighton given their misfortune the way they're playing, but I think most neutrals in the Premier League are kind of looking at Fulham now and thinking, would rather they stayed up than Brewster's Newcastle. And I think, as a local London paper, we can say that. Let's move on to Spurs, who also found a bit of form this week and obviously beat Fulham on Thursday. They thrashed Palace 4-1 yesterday in North London to kind of prove that the 4-0 win over Burnley the previous Sunday wasn't a one-off, it wasn't a fluke. It looks like it might have been the start of a turning point of sorts for Mourinho's side. And obviously Gareth Bale, fantastic again, and Harry Kane, just brilliant with 2 goals and 2 assists for Bale. We're going to kind of look ahead to the North London derby. I think the big question for Spurs now is how they approach that game against Arsenal, because they've taken their foot off the throttle in these games against Burnley and Palace, and to a lesser extent against Fulham. Certainly in the first half, they were quite adventurous at Craven Cottage. But the question is, will Mourinho kind of revert to type when they play Arsenal next Sunday? We'll come on to that shortly. But Simon, how do you assess the two sides going into the game? Arsenal, with a very forgettable 1-1 draw with Burnley this weekend. What's your reading? Do they have a lot to fear from Spurs, do you think, next weekend?
Yeah, it's. I think Arsenal fans are probably saying it's absolutely classic that Gareth Bale is suddenly looking like the Gareth Bale of old, and it's the North London derby. That I think is a slightly bitter pill to swallow. But I think also Mourinho, he was obviously been studying Arsenal and watching the way they play. But if you watch that Burnley game, I know Tottenham have come with this adventurous style of play. Bale, Son, Kane, even Dele Alli, featuring in that front four. But for me, if he was watching that Burnley game and then Arsenal, and the manner of, the individual error that led to the goal, I just think Mourinho would have been watching that and saying to his players, look, we don't need to go for the jugular against Arsenal, because more often than not, they will make mistakes and they will hand us the game. And I think we saw that a bit in the first North London derby, obviously, where Arsenal lost 2-0. And Mourinho, for me, his game plan will be about sitting and waiting for the error that's going to come from Arsenal. And if he needs to, they can go full throttle and go for the jugular. But I think the way Arsenal are playing at the moment, they're too inconsistent to go through periods of not making errors. And for me, Mourinho should be waiting for that mistake and waiting for a chance to pounce, really. Malik,
does that seem like a good approach for Mourinho? Is that one that you would endorse against his Arsenal side?
Yeah, as Simon said, I think any visiting manager or any opponent manager going up against Arsenal, they'll make the mistake if you give them a chance to. As we saw at the weekend, they were in so much control of that first half. It'll be interesting, obviously, to see what bearing Thursday has in terms of the Europa League. You can't really see Arsenal going to Greece and winning 4-0 and putting the tie to bed there, whereas you maybe could see Tottenham putting their tie against Zagreb to bed early. So it'll be interesting to see whether Arteta, has to, I'm not saying he's going to throw the North London derby, but certainly has to have the Europa League second leg in his mind a bit more than Mourinho does heading into that game.
Obviously, sitting and waiting for Arsenal to make a mistake is sort of, many would see it as a good plan. Dan, do you think from a Spurs perspective, most fans would want to see, given the form that everyone's in, Kane and Bale, obviously, but Son, came back in with an assist against Palace as well. Do you think Spurs fans would want to see him go and force a couple of mistakes?
Yeah, I think Spurs fans always want to see that. I do tend to agree with Simon. I think Mourinho will be a bit more cautious for this game. He always is in the big games against direct rivals, and a leopard doesn't change its spots, I think. So I think that's the way he'll play, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be, a very negative approach. And Spurs have so much quality on the counter attack, and we've seen that time and again through Kane and Son. And I think Bale now adds another element to that, and it looks pretty certain that Lucas Moura will play as a kind of fourth forward as well. And he's so quick on the counter attack and was so good in the press against Palace as well. So I think Spurs have a lot of weapons to hurt Arsenal, and in some respects it doesn't really matter, whether they're playing really front foot or whether they're sitting back a little bit and waiting for gaps to appear and for mistakes to emerge. I just think that the key thing for Spurs is to not find themselves in a situation where they're leading and they allow themselves to drop very deep, as they did against Fulham on Thursday, and invite pressure on that defence that still doesn't look particularly solid. And I do subscribe to the view that Benteke's equaliser yesterday was probably the best thing to happen to Spurs, because it just meant that there was no thought of coming out for the second half and protecting a 1-0 lead. They had to come out on the front foot, and you immediately saw within 7 minutes how devastating they could be when they're playing that way. So the thing they want to avoid is taking the lead and then falling into this trap that seems to have happened for whatever reason, whether it's Mourinho's instructions, whether it's mentality, whether it's fatigue, whether it's just a bad habit they can't shake. They need to avoid dropping kind of 10 yards into their own half and inviting pressure on Sanchez and Alderweireld, who have looked improved but still not kind of the Terry and Carvalho that perhaps Mourinho wants them to be. Just a kind of quick fire round of thoughts about top four finishes. I mean, Simon, do you now see Spurs as a good bet there? I mean, Chelsea are rejuvenated. United had a huge win this weekend. Leicester are stuttering a bit, but came back against Brighton. It's looking like a good race suddenly.
Yeah, and I think it could be one of the most interesting things about the rest of the season. I think that top four race, Man City, we know are going to win the title. The last relegation place, I think it's going to be interesting, as we've spoken about Fulham. The one I'd fear for in the top four race is Leicester. I saw them against Arsenal the other week. Harvey Barnes going off injured. Obviously without James Justin, no James Maddison. Tielemans, as brilliant as he has been, is getting through a lot of minutes. And you just worry about him if he's going to be going the same way. And Jamie Vardy doesn't quite look like the Jamie Vardy we know at the moment. I don't know if he's sort of nursing a bit of a problem, but he's not quite the player he was. So for me, they're the ones I slightly worry about. They have got the benefit of just being able to focus on the Premier League. But if anyone was going to slip out of that top four and allow someone like Spurs to get in, I think Leicester could be the side to fall out.
Yeah, I agree, Ari. Leicester, I think they're going to have a difficult time of it. They play, I think, Spurs, Man United and Chelsea as their last 3 games of the season. So, even if the likes of Maddison and Barnes are back and Vardy's firing again, they've got a really, really difficult end. I'd like to hear what Jack thinks about West Ham in a second, because by contrast, they've got...
Sorry, I forgot West Ham.
The end of the season. And I think we'd all kind of love to see them come good on what the promise of the campaign so far. I suppose Chelsea are the ones that I think will be pretty certain behind the 2 Manchester clubs. I just think that what Tuchel's done since he's come in is, if you'll pardon the cliche, very efficiently kind of gone about improving them and getting results. And by bringing in those players that Lampard had sort of cast aside, he's ended up with a really good amount of depth going into the latter part of the season.
With West Ham, I mean, it would be amazing, wouldn't it, if they managed to stay in? I don't know if everyone on here would be delighted to see them quite sneak in there. I think Kilpatrick might have 1 or 2 things to say about that. But
I've got not at Spurs' expense. Like, so I don't want to see you going on a European tour while I'm
at home.
Yeah, while I'm at home or headed to some outer reaches of Eastern Europe. That would be gutting. But no, otherwise, obviously, I'd like to see West Ham do well.
It's the thing with them is it would be fantastic. It's a long shot. I think even Moyes has said that's probably just out of their reach this season. But they do still have it all in their hands. They're still to play Leicester. They're still to play Chelsea. They're still to play Everton again, I believe. And they've got Manchester United coming up at the weekend after playing Leeds tonight. So it is a long shot. It would be remarkable if they did it. But it's all in their hands at the moment. And they've shown, unlike many teams this season, that they can keep up with the consistency of the schedule and injury problems as well. So they're in a very, very good place, but it would take something to stay there.
Yeah, and they're playing Leeds at home tonight. Chelsea hosting Everton. Let's stick with West Ham. We've got a reader question for you from David Mitchell. I don't think it's the David Mitchell of Peep Show fame, but he asks, how close is Arthur Masuaku to a return?
It should be a matter of weeks now. He's obviously had knee surgery, which was just before they played Leeds the last time, that no one elected to tell anyone about until Masuaku put it on his Instagram. But yeah, he should be a matter of weeks. He's back sort of doing some work on the grass. The interesting thing is he was so important to the way they played before his injury, but they've shown they can cope without him and play another way. So he's got a bit of a job on his hand to get back into the side when he does return.
I think I've answered the reader question about Spurs, which is about the approach against Arsenal. But Simon, you've got one on the Gunners from Emil Roby on Twitter. He says, do Arsenal need another midfielder to team up with Partey in the middle? Is Xhaka good enough in the long run?
I think it depends what your aspirations are and where you see the team. If you're expecting Arsenal to be challenging for the Premier League and consistently playing in the Champions League, I don't think Granit Xhaka is good enough to be starting week in, week out. I think he's perfectly fine if you're a top 4 team to be, one of your 4 central midfielders that you rotate in and out. But I don't think if you're a team who's challenging at the top, he wouldn't be starting for you in midfield. But right now, he's a player that they're sort of relying on and they need to. But longer term, I think it is an area you've got to improve if you want to be in that top 4.
Yeah, and we should get an idea of realistic ambitions for Spurs and Arsenal after next week's game, and that'll be the focus, I'm sure, of next Monday's Nutmeg. But for now, we're out of time, so we're going to wrap up. So thanks to Jack, Malik and Simon, and thanks to you for watching. Bye for now.